All right, your outline for our class tonight is on the back table. If you haven't got one, you can pick one of those up. Right. Yes. You can raise your hand if maybe Christy or when you want.
I recommend it out.
Everybody got one?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So tonight we're going to conclude kind of what we started last week, which was talking about the Scriptures, the Bible, and the role that the Bible plays in our understanding of the faith. Especially we're going to look tonight at the content of the Bible. Some of you are very familiar with the Bible, having been practicing Christians for a long time. Others may not be so much, so this is just going to be like a very general overview, either a refresher or new information, just to kind of get us situated in the Bible. We talked about a term last week, an important term that is used when we talk about the Bible, a German phrase. Anybody remember what that phrase was? Sitzenleben. So, situation in life. Basically, the context of what you're reading. It's always important, it's always good, it's always helpful when you're reading from the Bible, just to kind of be generally aware of the context. When was this particular book written? Why was it written? What was going on? What was the motivation for it being written? Because there's really a couple of thousand years in between different books, and so very different things going on in the world and in the lives of the people who are writing the Scriptures and what they're writing about. So it's always helpful to just kind of have a little bit of an understanding of the context in which the Bible was being written. We're going to talk about the chronology of the Bible tonight, the historical outline of the Bible. And it's helpful, I think, to keep a phrase in mind when we talk about history in terms of faith. And we're going to have a class in a couple of weeks. I'm going to be teaching that class too, just on the topic of church history. And I'll probably mention that phrase again, sacred history, because you know when you're studying history, you can do it in a couple of ways. You can look at it as just kind of a random series of events, one thing that takes place after another, or you can kind of see it as the unfolding of a story. So kind of one unified story that little by little is unfolding or playing itself out. And that's certainly the way in which we look at the history of the Bible, the history that is contained in the Bible. That's certainly the way that we look at church history, that it's not just a random, unorganized series of events, one occurring after the other, but that it's God's plan, which is unfolding itself in time. And so the more we understand kind of the overview of the history of the Scriptures, the history of the church, we're going to be able to understand and see better the hand of God, the plan of God as it unfolds in our life and in our world. So we don't just talk about history, we talk about sacred history. It's an unfolding of God's plan. And that's helpful to keep in mind when we talk about the history of the Scriptures. We're going to look at both the Old Testament and the New Testament tonight. Just again, a reminder for those who may be new to the Scriptures. The Old Testament refers to that period of the life of Jesus, that period of world history before Jesus was born. And the New Testament is that period of Jesus' life, starting with his birth. And if we look at just a very basic, bare bones timeline of human history, we would say, we're right here, right now in 2023, it's almost evenly divided in terms of where we are now and where we start with our biblical history. Now, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about takes place in what we call prehistory. Now, when I say prehistory, we're not necessarily saying that these events were not historical. They were, but that they kind of occurred before human beings recorded history. And so it's kind of hard for us to pinpoint, an exact year, an exact place, an exact understanding. But starting around 2,000 years BC, 2,000 years before Christ, we get into the recorded period of human history. And there are some things that are recorded before that, but this is kind of where we have a lot of stuff beginning. So it's almost equally balanced, 2,000 years ago to 2023 today. And we're going to see it's very helpful in terms of just keeping a very basic understanding of the timeline of the Bible, that these three marks, 2,000, 1,000, and 0, correspond almost perfectly to three of the most important people that we're going to meet in the Bible. In other words, approximately the year 2000 BC, 2,000 years before Christ, we have the birth of Abraham. And about 1,000 years later, anybody want to take a guess?
David.
Very good. King David. And then 1,000 years after him, roughly at the year 0, that's why it was chosen as the year 0, or probably better to say the year 1. It was probably actually around the year 3, but let's not get too particular about it. We have the birth of Jesus. So that's just kind of just an easy way to remember these three marks, 1,000 years apart. Approximately 2000 BC, birth of Abraham, 1000 BC, birth of David, and the dividing line between Old Testament and New Testament, Jesus. So it's pretty cool that we're living right now, because we are about as far from Jesus as Jesus was from Abraham, 2,000 years or so. So it's kind of a nice way to just conceptualize everything that we're going to that we read about in the Scripture. So remember, the word Bible comes from the Greek word for library. So when you're holding your Bible, even though it's usually one book with one cover, and we conceptualize it as a book, it's probably better to think of it as you're holding a bookshelf, or you're holding a library, you're holding a series of books that, just like if you would go into the library, and if you go into a library, the books are going to be kind of organized, Dewey Decimal System. I'm old enough to have had to learn that before the internet. Some of you are too, but most of the books in the library are kind of organized according to content and subject matter. But if you think of maybe the shelf where they put return books, and you have just a whole bunch of random books sitting next to each other, or maybe your bookshelf at home is kind of like that. Mine certainly is. That's kind of what we find in the Bible. We find all sorts of different books. Some of the books of the Bible are historical. The focus is explaining salvation history, sacred history, talking about how we moved from the creation of the world to Abraham, David, what these people meant and what God did in their life, and not just for them, but the way God used them to continue to unfold His plan for the world. Some of the books in the Bible are going to be poetry books, just like you might find some poetry books in the library. If you read the book of Psalms, for example, which is right at the heart of the Old Testament, that's really a book of poetry, or probably more specifically, it's a book of hymns. And so it was a song book, and that's why, as an aside, when you come to Sunday Mass, we usually sing the responsorial psalm because they were meant to be sung. It's a hymnal. You'll find the prophetic books, the books of the prophets who talk about some historical things, but also talk about, the moral life and what God calls every human being to do. What other kind of book? You'll find books of genealogy, where they take great pains to kind of show how generation led to generation. You'll also find law books in the Old Testament. That was, the legal code of the people of Israel, the ancient people of Israel, is embedded in the Old Testament, and so you'll find that. Just like, again, if you go into a library, you'll find all sorts of different kind of books. The first 5 books of the Old Testament kind of have a pride of place. That is to say that they were kind of, if all the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Bible, is considered inspired, and by the Jews is considered inspired as well, then those first 5 books are super inspired. It's almost like in the New Testament. Of course, every book in the New Testament is inspired, but the first 4 books, the Gospels, have a pride of place. They are the heart of the New Testament. Well, the heart of the Old Testament would be the first 5 books, which are commonly called the Pentateuch. Penta, which comes from the Greek word for 5. So it's the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And traditionally, the traditional author of the Pentateuch, does anybody know who the traditional author of the Pentateuch is?
Moses.
All right. Goodness gracious. If I go on Jeopardy, I'm taking it. So Moses is the traditional author of the Pentateuch. He obviously did not author all of it. How do we know that? Because in the last book of the Pentateuch, it talks about Moses' death. He's dead, so he couldn't have written about his death. But it certainly traces this authority to Moses, and he certainly very well could have had very much to do with the writing of the books themselves. Then we also have historical books, which are just that. They tell us the history of the people of Israel. The Pentateuch, the historical books. One of the things that we really use the Old Testament for, especially for us as Christians in the New Covenant, are the prophetic books, the prophets. And those are usually divided into the major prophets and the minor prophets. My terrible handwriting. The prophetic books. Then we find a set of literature that we just kind of throw together as the wisdom books. Where the purpose of the wisdom books is really not so much to teach about history, things that were going on historically, but teaching about theology, about the soul, about the life, about God, kind of more philosophical books, you might say. And then we have the deuterocanonical books. Mouthful. Okay. The deuterocanonical books, which are those books that we talked about last week, which are in the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible or the Jewish Old Testament. Deutero means second, so it's the second canon, that which is included in the canon. And we have finally we have usually just grouped by themselves, Psalms and Proverbs. Again, the book of Psalms, which was the hymnal for the people of Israel. The book of Proverbs, which are a set of proverbs. That's the word. And a set of wise sayings. And so, just very, very good little aphorisms for us to apply to our life. Okay? So we're going to look at the timeline of the Old Testament now. Okay, if we start with the book of Genesis, and one of the things that you'll notice as you get into reading the Bible and studying the Bible and looking at the Bible in terms of the historical outline, is you'll notice that the Bible is not laid out chronologically. So you can't start with Genesis and go to the last book of the Old Testament and that it follow, and that would be helpful, but that's not true. So it's always good to kind of keep track of where you are. But the book of Genesis does start, of course, with creation. It's the beginning. So that's why it starts with that very phrase, in the beginning. God said, let there be light. Okay, so you talked about, a couple of weeks ago, you talked about in the class about creation and the fall and so forth. So obviously, we put that as part of prehistory, and also in the Pentateuch, we find in the book of Genesis, we find Noah and his flood. That'll be part of this prehistory time. So, what we're looking at in terms of creation is at the very beginning. With the creation, we see that God is the creator. That God has a design for human beings. Human beings are created as the summit, the high point of creation. We also see at the very beginning that there was a rebellion, a human rebellion. Sin enters the world. And the book of Genesis talks about it in terms of rejecting God's commandment not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve, the first created human beings, disobey that commandment, and suddenly sin enters the world with all of its consequences. They are exiled from the Garden of Eden, which represents kind of that earthly paradise. But also very important, kind of as we conclude the creation story, is that promise that God will make things right. The rest of the Bible is the process by which God fulfills that promise, by which God prepares the world for the coming of the Messiah, and then for the life of the Messiah himself, Jesus Christ, and his ultimate victory on the cross and through his resurrection. So we find kind of the original need for a Savior at the very beginning, and then the rest of the Bible is going to unfold how God makes that come about. And he's going to do that through a series of covenants. That is to say, a series of promises that God makes to specific people as he's preparing that people to be the doorway through which the Messiah enters the world. And so we have creation, Noah's flood. You see, when sin enters the world, it becomes so prevalent in our ancient times that there is a complete catastrophe in the hand of God, who decides to wipe out pretty much all of creation, except for one just man and his family, Noah, who he commissions to save a remnant of the animal kingdom, basically, as the Genesis, a new Genesis for a new start to human history. And so we see the flood which wipes out all of human existence and human life, which concludes with the sign of the rainbow, which God says, this is a sign of my promise that I'm never going to wipe out human existence again until the very end. It's my covenant, again, a covenant now with this new process of creation, which is going to begin with Noah and his family. Okay? So we definitely would say that the book of Genesis would take place in this prehistory time, leading up to ultimately the life of Abraham. So we get around the year 1996 or so BC, which may be the best guess. It's still a very approximate year for the birth of Abraham. Abraham, who finds favor with God, as we read in the book of Exodus. I'm sorry. Let's go back to Genesis. Genesis concludes with the life of Moses. Who that's not right. Genesis does not do the Pentateuch, not Genesis. Okay. So with the book of Exodus, we move into the period of recorded history or so, with the life of Abraham. Okay? And Abraham, God makes his first great covenant after the covenant that he makes with Noah for all of humanity with Abraham and his descendants. And so it's a family covenant. God says it's going to be through your family that I'm going to create my chosen people. And ultimately we become known as the people of Israel, which was the name of Jacob's grandson, of Abraham's grandson. If you remember, if you've studied the Pentateuch in the book of Exodus, you'll know that Abraham and his wife Sarah were both elderly when God visited them and brought forth their first child. It was a sign of God's blessing on them. When he made the covenant with them, God told Abraham, your descendants, even though you're an old man, you don't have any children yet, your descendants will number more than the stars in the heavens. And so it was that promise to Abraham. Finally, through his son Isaac and Jacob, or Israel, God continued to form his people, the family of Abraham. It was the children of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel, for whom the 12 tribes of Israel were named. And these sons were taken into slavery in Egypt. So these would have been great-grandsons of Abraham. The people of Israel were so by this time, 4 generations or so, the number of the family of Abraham had grown fairly large. They had many sons and many children. And they had gone down to Egypt, the Bible says, to escape a famine. And for a while, everything was good in Egypt, but after a while, there came to the power of Pharaoh, who was intimidated by the growing number of Israelites, and who ultimately had them enslaved in Egypt. Now, we talked last time about a type. When we read the Old Testament as Christians, we look at what happened in the Old Testament as a type, a foreshadowing, a preview of what's going to happen in the New Testament. And certainly we look at the time of slavery in Egypt as representing our own captivity to sin. And ultimately the people are freed from their slavery by Moses, one of the great figures of the Old Testament. And Moses, who leads them through the desert to the promised land, back home to their original land, the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. And so, in a sense, Moses represents Jesus, who frees us from our captivity of sin and leads us back to the promised land, leads us to the glory of heaven. So we're moving quickly over this stuff, but that's the basic plot and outline. We would say that probably around that this took place around the year 1500 BC. Moses. And that's a very loose statement. And after 40 years of wandering in the desert, Moses dies. He's able to go on top of the mountain by the river Jordan, and he's able to see the promised land, but he doesn't enter it because of one of the sins that he committed on the way. And so he dies, and it's his lieutenant, Joshua, who finally leads the people across the Jordan River into the land of Canaan.
What was the sin he committed?
That he didn't trust in God when they were needing water, and so he, instead of just asking God to give him water, he started doing an incantation which involved kind of superstitious pounding together rocks and so forth. That's how the Bible describes it. He was also probably around 500 years old, so
Probably. He found those tablets and the Ten Commandments on that mount, didn't he?
So along the way, for those 40 years in the desert, God, who had called him, first of all, just the life of Moses. Again, we see a lot of parallels with Jesus. Moses was not supposed to have lived. The Pharaoh had put into a law that all male children of Israel should be killed at birth because he didn't want that community growing and growing and growing. So when Moses was born, a boy child, his mother put him in a basket and placed him in the Nile River, and leaving him up to the providence of God rather than turn him over to the Egyptians and have him be killed. He was ultimately found and adopted by the wife of the Pharaoh, and he was raised kind of as an adopted prince, royalty. He ran afoul as an adult. He ran afoul of the Pharaoh and the people of Egypt because he defended one of the Israelite slaves who had been killed who had killed an Egyptian, and so everybody turned against him, and he had to flee. He left out into the area where he would ultimately lead the people to freedom, and was living out there by Mount Horeb, and eventually God calls him in a very powerful part of the Old Testament. God says, Moses, you're the one who's going to deliver my people to freedom. And so he goes back, he confronts Pharaoh. The Pharaoh won't listen to him. God said, let my people go. Ultimately, Moses' words are backed up by 10 plagues. And finally, Pharaoh says, get out of here. All these terrible things were happening throughout Egypt. The Pharaoh changes his mind as soon as the Israelites leave, and they start chasing after them. We have the great event at the Red Sea where God parts the Red Sea, the people of Israel cross, and then drowns the Egyptians who are fleeing after them. And so they're free, but then they're in the desert, and it's going to take 40 years of wandering in the desert before they finally make it home. One of the great things that happened along the way, of course, was when they got back to Moses' homeland there in the desert, God called them back atop the mountain and presented him with the tablets of the law, the commandments, the 10 commandments. And sent them back down. When he went back down, he found that the Israelites had already turned away from God and were worshiping idols. And so that 40 years in the desert didn't get off to a great start, and they would have a lot of problems throughout. The people grumbling against Moses. They would say, yeah, we were slaves in Egypt, but at least we had enough to eat. You brought us out here in the desert to die. Ultimately, God feeds them in the desert, takes care of them, and helps them continue their path. So Moses really is the deliverer, the one who not only brings the people to freedom, also gives them the law, just as Jesus in the New Testament will give the gospel to his people, and ultimately leads them to the promised land, to salvation, the land of milk and honey. And then we meet Joshua, who actually is the one who leads Israel into the promised land. So around this time would be the other books of the Pentateuch. Most of the history that we've been talking about we'll find in Genesis and Exodus. Leviticus is that law book that I was talking about. It's just a catalog of the laws of the people of Israel as they got established. Numbers, basically the census results of the people of Israel in this early time. Who were the tribes, how many there were, and so forth. Deuteronomy, which also contains some of the history of this journey of Abraham, Moses, Joshua, and so forth. So, about the year 1500 or so, we would conclude the time of the Pentateuch. Starting in around the year 1400 or so, you find it on the back of your outline on the Bible timeline. We get to the period of the Judges. So when we hear the word judge, we think of a legal scholar, wearing long robes and passing judicial decisions, and that's a little bit about what these biblical judges did. But basically, these were charismatic leaders of Israel, of the people of Israel, of the 12 tribes, after they had returned to the Promised Land, who helped them establish themselves. In the years that they'd been gone, the centuries that they'd been gone, other nations had moved in to Canaan, to the land of Israel. And so a lot of what had to happen was that they had to make a place for themselves to live and establish themselves. And it was these judges, these charismatic figures, who kind of set that happening. And the judges really lead us lead the people of Israel for about the next 350 to 400 years. And we find them in the book of Judges. The other two historical books, which kind of describe the people of Israel now that they're back in the Promised Land, the land of Israel at this time, would be the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So these are Samuel and Chronicles are historical books which describe this time of judges and the people of Israel without really they didn't really have any defined political authority. They were just kind of tribal groups and families getting reestablished in the people in the land of Israel, but also practicing their unique religious faith, their faith in God. And I say unique because one of the things that separate the Israelites from all the other people around them is that they were monotheists. They believed that there was only one God. And they were very strict about that. So we get to the end of the period of the Judges with the very first king of Israel. King Saul. And it's interesting as we read in 2 Samuel about this process of getting a king. The people of Israel went to the prophet and said, all these other nations around us, they're starting to get kings, this kind of clear official political authority. and it seems like it's working really well with them. You know, when you have one guy who's got authority, whose word is law, you're able to raise up armies. You're able to, make an efficient society that works and that functions. And the people of Israel said, "We want a king as well." And at first, God said, "No. I'm your king. And if you would only keep the law, then you wouldn't need this human authority to kind of, make your political decisions for you." But the people went on and on and on, and so finally God relented and anointed a man named Saul as king over the Israelites. And almost as soon as Saul is chosen, he is rejected. And God says, "I'm going to give you a new king." And that's where we get to David. With King David, we have the second great covenant. The first one being the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with all the people of Israel, all of Abraham's descendants. With David, the covenant gets a little narrower. God says to David that you are going to have an eternal kingship over Israel. You and your descendants will remain my king over my people forever. And that's why the New Testament begins with the Gospel of Matthew, taking great pains to trace the genealogy of Jesus, to include King David, to show that Jesus is a descendant of David, and as the everlasting King, Jesus fulfills that covenant, that promise that God made to David. This is a good point to take about a 5-minute break if we'd like to do that. So I need to go to the restroom or get some more on. Help yourself.
I don't think you will. This is not the same Saul that became Paul. Okay, I have to say he got born somewhere later. Okay, I just said.
He was born after Jesus.
Okay. He was born after Jesus. Okay. I don't think it's like that. He's supposed to be 5 years old.
We got a lot of Sauls and we got a lot of Josephs. We don't really know. There's a lot of theories. We don't really know when he was born. So, December 25th is probably not, we don't know when. It's David we've chosen to celebrate. So, and the reason that we chose it is because it's the winter solstice. It's the time in which the days start becoming longer. And 2,000 years ago, that was very important. Made it through the winter, and now, so Jesus is the one who is the light of the world. So they chose that day.
When I saw April boy,
There's a lot of theories. We don't know.
well, just like Jason Case, he's Big Bang Theory. Everybody here. I'm like, okay.
she actually going through?
Okay, if we can kind of come back. So King David is really one of the most fascinating figures of the Old Testament. He was very zealous about the Lord, and he had God's favor and God's love because he was very committed to the things of God, but he was also a very great sinner. A very great sinner. So much so that he was responsible for committing adultery and having his lover's husband killed. Her husband was in the army, and so he made sure that he was killed in battle, so he could marry the guy's wife, Bathsheba. And we see in one of the most poignant instances in the Old Testament where God, through the prophet, tells David, what he's done. And David has this very severe repentance, true remorse for what he's done, and asking God to take his life. And God ultimately forgives him. He marries Bathsheba, and they have a child who becomes one of the great kings of Israel, King Solomon. Solomon, whose reign, very rare in this whole history of Israel. Solomon's reign was a reign of peace. The people of Israel were not fighting any wars. It was a time of prosperity and wealth. It was a time of devotion to the Lord. The temple in Jerusalem was built. It was David who moved the I guess we call it the capital of the people of Israel, from Hebron, the city of Hebron, where he was born, to Jerusalem. And Solomon builds the temple there in Jerusalem, and is really kind of seen as one of the great kings. It's a good reminder always when I read that story of David and Bathsheba and Solomon, how God can take terrible events and bring amazing good things out of it. And certainly that's what happened with Solomon. David is the traditional author of the Psalms. They're often called Psalms of David. And, when you read the Psalms, you really can kind of get an insight into why David was very much beloved by the Lord. Because the Psalms are really deep prayers with a great insight into human emotion and into human existence. They're Psalms to express joy. They're Psalms of repentance and remorse. They're Psalms of anger when things are going wrong in our life. They're Psalms of gratitude for the closeness of God in times of difficulty. It really covers the whole gamut of human emotions. One of the things that we do as priests is pray the Liturgy of the Hours, which is 5 different times a day, pray the different, mostly the Psalms. And so we become, and a lot of the lay people do it as well. It's a great, beautiful prayer which sanctifies, the different times of the day: morning prayer, afternoon, midday prayer, evening prayer, night prayer, and the rhythm of those prayers is the Psalms. And sometimes when you're praying those Psalms, you're going through the same thing. You're angry at somebody, or you're frustrated, or you're joyful and thankful for something. Sometimes you're reading Psalms that have nothing to do with what you're feeling in your life right there. But it reminds you that there are people in the world that are going through these things, and to kind of be united to them. So the Psalms still, 3,000 years later, retain their force and their strength and their beauty. Solomon is also credited with writing several of the books of the Bible. Find it here. Especially the book of Proverbs. Some of the wisdom literature as well. So we find David and Solomon as kind of that, the icon for the perfect, or not the perfect, David was certainly not perfect, but the icon for the ideal king of Israel. And again, the New Testament will take pains to show that Jesus himself was a descendant of King David. Shortly after the reign of Solomon, there is a break in Israel, a civil war, where the 10, about the year 930, the 10 northern tribes split off from the tribe of Judah. The 12th tribe are the Levites, and they're kind of the priestly class. They didn't really, you kind of find them in both camps. Judah was the largest of the tribes, and the 10 northern tribes split off and kind of went their own way. And that's when we start calling the people of Israel Jews, from the word Judah. So with the division of the kingdom in about the year 930, we have the northern kingdom and the kingdom of Judah. It is the kingdom of Judah which continues the Davidic line. So the sons of David, the descendants of David, maintain the kingship of the people of Judah, of the Jews, who are centered in Jerusalem. In around the year 723, the northern 10 tribes are conquered. So they're gone. They're conquered by the Assyrians, and they're lost history. Sometimes you hear the phrase "the lost tribes of Israel." Well, they're gone. They're really heard from no more. But the people of Judah continue to exist in and around Jerusalem until the 6th century BC, around the year 586. When the kingdom of Judah is also conquered, this time by the Babylonians, modern-day Iraq, roughly, and they're taken into captivity. So we begin what's called the Babylonian captivity, Babylonian exile. And a lot of the scriptures were written during this time of the destruction of the northern kingdom in the 7th century and BC and 586, and also during the time of the captivity itself. For example, the prophet Ezekiel, one of the great major prophetic books of the Old Testament, is written from exile. Ezekiel was born, but but as a small boy, he was a small boy when the people were exiled to Babylon, so all of his writings take place from Babylon, not in Israel. And many of the other prophets take place during that we read in the Old Testament take place during that time as well, including the prophet Hosea and Jeremiah, two of the most important prophets are during that time as well. This captivity lasts for about 50 years until 530 or so, when the kingdom of Persia, under the leader Cyrus, conquers Babylon, and one of the first things that he does is to free the people of Israel, the Jews, to go back to Jerusalem to reestablish their home. And so there's great joy. They go back home. They're able to rebuild the temple, reestablish their life, and so forth. And then around the year 400 BC, the last of the prophetic books is written, the book of Malachi. Okay? In the 3rd century BC, the Seleucid or Greek, around the year 200 BC, the Seleucid Empire, which is basically a Greek empire, conquers the Jews, and Jerusalem, Judea, becomes a part of the larger Greek empire, Seleucid Empire. They do have nominal kings of Israel at this time, but they're basically vassals of the Greek Empire. In the year 164 BC, we have the Maccabean rebellion. The Jews rebel against the Seleucid Empire, the Greeks, and they are victorious. They kick the Greeks out of Jerusalem. They reestablish their independence. This is during the time of the Deuterocanonical books, so these books are in the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible. It talks about the Maccabean rebellion. One of the things that the Maccabees do as soon as they are victorious in their war is to reconsecrate the temple. The temple had been turned into a Greek gymnasium. It had been blasphemed, and so they had to reconsecrate the temple to the worship of God. God allowed the temple candles to burn for 8 days. That becomes the basis of the Jewish holiday that they still celebrate, the holiday of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. So all that takes place in about the year 164. And then in 63 BC, they're conquered once again, this time by the Romans. They got conquered a lot. And of course, the Romans were still in charge 63 years later when Jesus himself was born. That's why, that's why Jesus had so many problems with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, and why when Jesus interacted with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the leaders of the Jewish people, the scribes and the Pharisees and so forth, while they always tried to entrap him and get him in trouble with the Romans, because the Romans had the political authority, the political power. We get, of course, the birth of Jesus around year 3 or so, and his life was probably about 33 years long. So around the year 30, he began begins his public ministry. It's estimated, if you read the Gospels, it's estimated that Jesus lived for about, that Jesus ministered publicly for about 3 years, teaching and his parables and so forth. Around the year 30, calling of the 12 apostles. Again, the 12 apostles which kind of fulfill the type of the 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament. The people of the Old Testament promised had 12 tribes, Jesus had 12 apostles. Again, the New Testament starts by showing that Jesus is a descendant of David, but we also find in the life of Jesus that just as God's covenant has been broadening out over time, that now he's going to be a Messiah not just for the Jewish people, but for all people. And not an earthly Messiah, but that he's going to give his people not an earthly kingdom, but he's going to lead them to the kingdom of God. He establishes, as the New Testament letter to the Hebrews talks about, he establishes an eternal kingship. And through his death and resurrection on the cross, which we will talk about, of course, in depth in later classes, he reverses the punishment due to the sin of Adam and Eve. Over the period of salvation history, God has been preparing by calling a chosen people and by leading the people and by giving them the law and the books of the scriptures and so forth, has been leading and preparing the way for Jesus to come to be the Messiah for all people. So around the year 33 or so, we have death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus. And about 40 years later or so, as the books of the New Testament are being written, many of them were not written until after this point. But around the year 70 or so, we have the fall of Jerusalem. There's another revolt, this time a revolt against the Romans. The Jewish people lose this war, and the temple is sacked, and Jerusalem falls. There's a great scattering. We'll talk about that more when we get into the history of the church, but that great scattering coincides with the time of the 12 apostles, and they are also scattered out in Jerusalem, but they begin to go out into all the world, all the different nations around the world, and begin preaching to all people about Jesus Christ and bring people to faith in him. So that is a very rough overview, outline of the story of the Scriptures. You've heard the phrase, the devil is in the details. So I think in terms of the Bible, we might say the angel is in the details, because it's in reading the Scriptures that you really see the hand of God at work. Through all of these human events, God himself is present. And like I said earlier, one of the beautiful things we find about God is that he can take human catastrophe, the Great Flood, for example, or these wars and violence, or the life of King David, where he has his lover's husband put to death. He can take these horrible things, God can, and bring good out of them. And we see him doing that all throughout salvation history. He even does it with our first sin. At the Easter Vigil, when those of you who are coming into the church during the Mass, when you're going to be baptized or confirmed or receive your first Holy Communion, there's a beautiful long prayer that we sing at the beginning of that Mass. And one of the phrases in that long prayer concerns the sin of Adam and Eve. And in Latin, it's, well, we'll do the English. In English, it's, oh, happy fault, oh, necessary sin of Adam. And so ultimately, we're saying that even this first sin, the first sin of Adam and Eve, even though it was terrible in the moment, in the grand scheme of things, it's a wonderful thing because it gained for us so great a Redeemer. It led to this whole series by which God brought forth Jesus into the world. Jesus, who doesn't just make things as they were, but makes things better. He doesn't just give us an earthly paradise, he gives us the kingdom of God. And so that's really one of the takeaways that we find as we read through the scriptures is the way in which, through faith, God can take terrible events and bring beautiful, wonderful things out of them. And that's certainly something that most of us, each of us in our own way, can take with us in our own life as well. We got about 4 minutes if there's any questions, comments. Yes, sir.
Where's the Catholic Church come in after this? Because the Romans conquered right there, so where's the Catholic Church?
Catholic Church starts in 33 AD.
Right there. Okay.
During the public ministry of Jesus, where he chooses the 12 apostles, and we'll get into all this when we start talking about church history. The 12 apostles are the foundation of the church after his death and resurrection. They are the ones who begin to build the family faith.
So when Moses died, did he go to purgatory?
Good question. Obviously the Bible doesn't talk specifically about that, and the Jewish people themselves kind of had a developing understanding of the afterlife. Most of what they talk about in the Old Testament is called Sheol, which is kind of this shadowy existence that is kind of a quasi-existence, but not really, that really your only existence worth talking about is your existence during this life. There is some talk of reward or punishment in the afterlife, but it's all very, very vague. So they really wouldn't have thought too much. They really kind of believed that after you died, you were dead. Although that was changing. And by the time of Jesus, you had two major groups of Jewish people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees denied any kind of afterlife. But the Pharisees had developed, were that strain of Jewish thought that had developed kind of a more advanced understanding of the afterlife. What do we think about Moses? Well, Jesus died on Good Friday, died on Friday. He rose on Sunday, so that leaves the question of what happened on Saturday. A lot of the doctors of the church, the great saints and spiritual thinkers from the early centuries, say that during that day that he was in the tomb before his resurrection, that Jesus descended into, and we say it in the Apostles' Creed, he descended into hell. Now, when we say that, we're not talking about the hell of the damned, that is eternal, but kind of a place, a waiting room in a sense, where the just people of the Old Testament epoch, Moses and David and Elijah, the prophets, and so forth, were kind of awaiting the resurrection, awaiting the victory of Jesus over sin and death, so that the paradise could be opened, and that he descended into hell to release them, to bring them into the kingdom of heaven. The other thing that we know about Moses from the New Testament is that at the Transfiguration, when Jesus was transfigured, just a few months before his death, he was seen speaking with Moses and Elijah on top of that mountain. And, subject to eternal damnation. That's a long answer for. I'm not sure, but we can have faith that they were waiting. That everything hinges. For us as Christians, certainly everything hinges on the cross and the resurrection. That's where sin is defeated and victory is won, and everything is kind of waiting. And everything that was broken at the beginning with our original sin is overcome in that moment. Good question. All right. I'm not sure what. I don't have my calendar here. What's the topic next week?
Teaching authority of the church.
Teaching authority of the church. You say who's doing that?
Got you hooked up with bringing forward what more you want.
Okay.
All right, not that.
No.
You know, where my book was up, is that fight that I'm doing.
He conquered Babylon. And one of those things where the enemy, my enemy is my friend. It's actually the word is interesting. The word one of the prophets uses for Cyrus is Messiah. He was very much loved by Israel. There's somebody here tonight that I said last week I was going to talk to you after class, and I don't remember who that was, but yes. Can you come over here? I didn't talk to you all today. That's good. Let's walk over to my office.
Okay, can I get my stuff off the table first?
We're going to walk over to my office.
Bringing my kid to me, or I twin, I know which one you're kid. I you learn the word you say. There's a new scholar you have well, I say your mom, I'm like that. Always stop first. I see you get dressed in the dark.
That's the translation. You need one? No. You're going to need it first. Yeah, I wasn't thinking about it. He's everyone. Yes.
has been fun. I've enjoyed it. Often video, you know. Yeah.